Welcome to this video that is over the Part A lecture notebook in Module 2. I will be going over the coding parts for the first three activities about reading and fixing error messages and casting and printing. The summary activity I will not be going over because that is for you to write your summary points and code examples, and I did get you started on that and talked about it in the lecture video that you should definitely watch to understand what I'm looking for. So let's just jump right into it in terms of reading error messages and fixing code. So here, the instructions are the code block below will not execute correctly. Let's go ahead and try running it. We see that we have an invalid syntax and it's pointing with this caret here to line 1. Notice I'm displaying the line numbers here, 1, 2, 3. You can toggle that right here. You can show line numbers or get rid of line numbers inside of code blocks. But we will go ahead and say show line numbers just so that we can see how to decipher what the type of information is given in error messages with relation to where the errors occur on lines and in what part of the line the error is occurring. So we are to read the error messages. Notice I say messages because there's multiple errors here. As you fix one, others will follow because there was an error here. The code did not execute beyond this line. As soon as there's an error, the code stops. So this line of code, which actually has two separate errors, we don't see those multiple errors yet until we fix the errors that came before it. So now we see, read the error messages as you systematically fix it to define and print the integer 4, stored as the variable 4, that this is the problem. 4 equals nothing. We don't have anything there, and that's an invalid syntax. You can't write 4 equals and then have a blank. It needs to be something. Well, we know what the something is. It has to be the integer 4. Now, if we run this, we see that there's this invalid syntax and it's pointing to 4, and you say, well, what's going on here? Why is that an error? Well, there's a missing comma right here. You say, how are you supposed to realize there's a missing comma? This is a little subtle, but notice that in a print command, when we're putting multiple things together, there's usually commas separating each piece that we want printed out. This has been shown above in various places where we see these commas are there. It's very specific, and I had that same type of error here in the instructor-led activity. So let's go ahead and fix that comma. We can see it's pointing to 4. Now notice it didn't point to where the comma you probably want to put it here. It's going to point where it said it was looking effectively for a comma to separate the arguments. But what happened is it found 4 and it says, I don't know how to evaluate this. This is an invalid syntax. It needed some sort of separation, a comma, between the types of outputs that you're looking to print. So by putting the comma there to fix that syntax error, we will now receive a new type of error. In fact, it's called a type error. And you'll notice this is just pointing to line 3. There's no caret to point to what's going on, but it does say that the type function takes 1 or 3 arguments. This is a function that we've seen above, and what it does is it returns the type, what type of variable, or excuse me, the type of a variable that you give it. But we didn't give it anything, so that's invalid. That produces a type error. Basically, anytime you have a function, user-defined, or a built-in function in Python, and we'll get into user-defined functions and more about functions in Module 3 in general. But when you have a function, you say, well, I'm expecting certain types of variables. And if you give it the wrong types of variables or the wrong number of variables, you'll often see something like a type error. And it will say, this is wrong. Like I need 1, or in this case, 3 arguments. And you could read more about the type function to see what maybe the other arguments are, but it at least needs a variable that it's being asked to return what the type is. And we're not returning anything. So as soon as we put 4 in, we see that this prints out exactly what I'm looking for, the type of variable 4. So that's it. That's how you do the first activity. It shouldn't take too long, hopefully. And if there's some trouble, hopefully this video helps. Now let's look at this next activity, more practice fixing errors. Fill in the missing pieces of the code cell below to define a variable y as a floating point number version of the integer of x and print both y and x. So I'll go over the coding part. The second part is to create a markdown cell below the code. So you can either select here and press the B key, select here and press the A key to create a code cell. Now it always creates a code cell as default, but you can press the M key to turn it into a markdown cell. Or you can just, be using this drop-down menu. I've shown this before, but I'm not going to do that part. And you can also, again, add add cells here. If you add it here, it always adds below, but then you can just drag it. There's always lots of ways to do things. But at any rate, I'll say what's kind of going on in this video, but generally I won't go over in very much detail the interpretation or explanation. I'm just going to show the code for how it works. I'll discuss a little bit about why it works, but I'm always going to look for making sure that you're taking the time to understand what's happening and you actually explain things clearly in terms of here's what each line of code is doing, here's what the functionality is in this code cell. That's a very important part of this class. But at any rate, we see that if we run this, let's go ahead and try to run it first just so we can see where the error occurs. Notice there's a type error and it's pointing to line 6. And it says, well, y is of type, and then there's this blank type, right? Type takes 1 or 3 arguments. And we see, oh, type here and type here. Well, this clearly, if y is supposed to be of type what, it should be type y. And we're saying x equals something and x is of type x. Those clearly need to be fixed there. But just because we run this doesn't mean we are actually getting the code to work as it should, because notice this comment is saying what this line of code should do, and it doesn't have it. But even though there's a blank input to casting the float, we're saying the float of nothing. But that didn't create an error, unlike having type of nothing. So what is y if this is what we've done? Like somehow y was created and it went and executed line 6. So let's go ahead and run this. We see that if you cast float of nothing, that's actually cast as a 0. But we wanted to cast the integer of x as a float, which means we really need int of x here. That's what we're asked to do. So now we see y is 1.0. If you think of what int of x is, that should just be 1. And then the float of that should produce the 1.0 because it turns the integer 1 into a float 1, which is 1.0. And then we're printing the variables and their types. So that's something for you to explain in your markdown cell. And now let's go ahead and get to this last activity I'll be covering. So use the comments in the code cell below to help fill in the missing pieces of the code that creates and prints the string variable str, which I would just say string underscore var, str underscore var, string underscore var. So if we look at these code comments, we see that we're supposed to first cast x as a string, and then we are supposed to first cast x as an int, and then cast as a string. And then this string variable is made through concatenation of the string. We take the x string, we add to that string, which is a concatenation. It just puts the two string variables together, and we'll have these print commands. Now, if you try to run this, again, we get a syntax error. Notice it points to where this comment is because you cannot assign a variable as a code comment. So what we're actually supposed to do here in line 3 is cast x as a string. So there we go. We've cast x as a string. And then proper code commenting is 2 spaces and then that hashtag or pound symbol. In this line of code, now we could run this, so at least it gets past line 3. Now we see that there's an error at line 5. And we have this invalid syntax again. We're supposed to cast x as an int and then cast as a string. So let's cast like this. All right, so this will first cast x as an int and then cast x as a string. So you work from the inner to the outer, just like composition of functions that you're familiar with in algebra. So now if we run this, the whole thing runs and you see 3.14159, which is just taking this and casting it as a string, is certainly a reasonable approximation of pi, whereas 3 is a terrible approximation of pi. There is nothing you have to fix about this. Everything else runs. Okay, that is it for these embedded activities. It was hopefully pretty straightforward and not too bad, and you can check your work with this video. And just remember, you have to do this one on your own. In general, I will not have these types of summary points for you. You have to come up with your own summary points. I'm getting you started. I have 4 summary points here. You need to give at least an additional summary point, and you need to give an example that is clearly related, showing what's going on in relation to these summary points. So you should have some example that shows how to create variables of type int, float, string, and list. You should have an example where you're using the print command and the type function. You should have an example that shows how to do casting of variables, and also an example that shows how to make a list using the range function. And you should have at least one additional summary point and an example that's related to it. Remember to write in complete, clear sentences. Your summary point should be concise, clear, but written in complete sentences that explain something that you've seen, learned in the notebook with a clear example that works, that shows everything. So that's it. Thank you for listening.